All right, so this is actually going to be my first video of 2022. So first of all, Happy New Year's to everybody. I appreciate all of the support that this channel got over 2021, and hopefully leading into 2022, we can grow this community even further. So with that being said, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of good news here to start the year off, because we have a multitude of states around the country that are actually raising their minimum wage right now. So this is a little bit of good news and somewhat bad news, because as you guys know, $15 minimum wage, many of these states are not even going to be getting up to that $15 number. But in the broader picture of things, even in many places around the United States, $15 minimum wage is not even enough in and of itself. So a little bit of good news, bad news here, but we'll take what we can get to start us off. So I wanted to read you some of the details, and then we'll get into more details in terms of how completely inadequate this actually is. But again, workers in 21 states will see a rise in the minimum wage in the new year. And they say in New York and 7 other states, the increases are part of scheduled raises in efforts to reach the $15 minimum wages in the years to come. The additional states are California, Delaware, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, according to a report from payroll experts at Walters Kluwer Legal and Regulatory US, a company that provides finance, compliance, and regulatory information. And they say that states also increased rates because of previously approved legislation or ballot initiatives and other state mandated wage increases in places like Arizona, Colorado, Maine, Minnesota, Montana, Ohio, South Dakota, Vermont, and Washington, and are due to automatic cost of living adjustments that are based on inflation. So again, we're kind of sort of talking about like the bare minimum here, keeping up with inflation and other cost of living adjustments that have absolutely skyrocketed recently. So, you know, again, the bare minimum, this isn't the end all be all, but they continue saying that Missouri voters passed a proposition in 2018 that gradually increases the state minimum wage to $12 over 5 years, and Michigan, New Mexico, and Virginia adopted similar legislation with $12 goals. So again, I'm not saying that this is the end all be all. Obviously, $12 over the next 5 years is nowhere close to enough. It's the same thing as Joe Biden when he was promising the $15 minimum wage increase. It was $15 to getting us to $15 as a minimum wage by 2025. So listen, you know, $15 as we're about to get to is not enough already in many parts of this country to be a sustainable living wage. But on top of that, if you're going to stall it until 2025, well then, okay, by then the minimum wage is going to need to be, you know, somewhere closer to like $30 to actually be a living wage. So we're really lagging behind, but it's, you know, somewhat good to see some movement in the right direction. At the very bare minimum, at least this would help some people be able to keep up with inflation. And I know that's, you know, it's not saying a lot, but we'll take what we can get right now with how shitty everything has been recently. But again, these are the 21 states that are raising their minimum wages. Again, Arizona, California, you guys can read the list for yourself, and I'll link this down below if you want to check out the specifics within your own home states. But now we get to a little bit of a reality check, because while this is good that a lot of these states are, you know, raising their minimum wages, albeit, you know, some of them are only going up to $12, some of them even, you know, like $9, and you see here like $13. Many of these are even below the $15 minimum wage number. But I actually brought up this living wage calculator, which I think is a pretty good indicator. It's from MIT, and they basically just calculate what the actual living wage should be, because, you know, in different counties around the United States, there's different cost of living, right? Everywhere has different rent, different food prices, etc. So you kind of have to have a nuanced approach when you're looking at what an actual living wage would look like, depending on which county that you're in. And obviously, I still think there should be a federal raise to the minimum wage from the current $7.25 an hour. But just to give you a perspective, I pulled up Fulton County, Georgia here, which is my home city of Atlanta, and this encompasses like the western half of the city of Atlanta. And just to give you like an average perspective in terms of how much you would actually need to be earning to have a comfortable life for you and your family. So they give a good, pretty good breakdown here, basically pointing out that different situations, no matter which situation you are in, whether you have kids, whether you're in a relationship, whether you're single, $15 is simply not enough, at least in Fulton County. And I guarantee if you go and check whatever county that you live in, I'll link this down in the description below if you want to go check, but I guarantee that whichever county that you happen to live in, it's most likely that $15 is nowhere close to enough, especially not to support a family. But let's just look at the breakdown here. So a one adult in Fulton County, Georgia, okay, one adult with absolutely no children, still a $15 minimum wage would not be enough. And the current minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And that's actually embarrassingly enough, because my home state of Georgia, federal law obviously overrides state law. And even in my home state of Georgia here, the actual minimum wage is like $5 an hour. It's like $5.25 an hour. And it's being overridden by the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour, neither of which are even remotely close to being a living wage. As you can see here, even the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour is not even half of what an actual living wage would be. And that's only for, a single adult who doesn't have any kids, right? So if you actually wanted to start a family, which, many conservatives and even liberals will come out and preach about, family values and how that's the most important key part of living the American dream. Well, okay, let's look at just like an average typical American family, what they would need in Fulton County, Georgia. Well, if you have two adults and they are both working full time and they have two children, which is about the average, okay, you would need a minimum wage of $21.36 per hour, okay, to have a comfortable life for them and their family. Again, we're not talking about anything generous. We're not talking about having an extra vacation home. We're talking about like being able to meet the bare necessities in a way that you're not constantly on the edge of falling off a financial cliff, basically. So again, if you actually want to live the American dream, as many people love to preach about, then you would need roughly $21 an hour, okay? And that is for two parents who are working full time. And again, this is talking about right now in the year 2022, okay? So all of these policies that are being put forward that are estimating, oh, well, we might get to almost $15 by 2025. Well, okay, you're playing this game of catch up where you are never actually going to catch up. So in many ways, it's kind of disingenuous that a lot of these policies are not being aggressive enough in raising and bumping up the minimum wage fast enough, because then you're just tying them into this, barely keeping up with inflation rates where, you're not actually making any advancements. Your wages, even though they may be going up in successive years, they might not even be enough to keep up with inflation, let alone give you more like spending power to be able to live a better life. So in that way, it's kind of disingenuous in a lot of these places with their minimum wage increases. But that's lesson number one, is that, even a lot of these places, as you can see, that are not even raising it up to $15 an hour, that's nowhere even close to enough. Even if it was $15 an hour and you could snap your fingers and make that the minimum wage right now, then even that might not be a living wage in many places around the United States. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is the political lesson from all of this. So let's just remind ourselves of the embarrassing failure of the Democratic Party to not get the $15 federal minimum wage passed way back during the earlier parts of the Joe Biden administration last year. So just to give you a reminder here, federal efforts to increase the minimum wage. So the federal minimum wage will remain at $7.25 an hour, a rate that has not moved since it began in 2009. Okay, the federal minimum wage, with all of the inflation and the cost of living increasing exponentially depending on which sector of the economy you are looking at, okay, it has not been raised in over a fucking decade, which is the longest period that American workers have not seen a raise in the minimum wage. So again, we're talking about a political situation here where Biden not only could do the overwhelmingly popular thing by aggressively raising the federal minimum wage, but on top of that, you would be ending the longest streak in modern American history where workers have not seen a wage. So it is long, long overdue, and yet President Biden completely failed to get that federal minimum wage passed. So President Joe Biden and some progressive Democrats have previously advocated for a $15 federal minimum wage, and by signing an executive order, of course, we remember that he did this for federal contracted workers, basically, and I guess applause to you for doing that very bare minimum, but we also know how they failed to pass the actual federal $15 minimum wage due to a motherfucker called the Senate parliamentarian. Okay, so just to remind you guys, okay, the Senate parliamentarian is an appointed position. They are not elected. Their position can be replaced. They are fireable. They can be simply ignored if Kamala Harris wanted to ignore the Senate parliamentarian. But basically, Joe Biden's administration ran on a $15 minimum wage. They said they were going to get it passed, and it was embarrassing. Okay, keep in mind, it's $15 minimum wage by 2025 when that would have already been outdated at that point. So it was already a half-measured neoliberal approach to raising the minimum wage. But even that, they couldn't get past the Senate parliamentarian. It just shows you that he doesn't actually give a shit about giving people living wages, let alone passing his half-assed neoliberal approach to raising the minimum wage. So if you can't get this past the Senate parliamentarian, you're clearly not willing to even go to the mat or fight for it at all. Republicans have historically literally fired the Senate parliamentarian to pass through massively unpopular pieces of legislation, but you somehow can't get past this, almighty God in the Senate parliamentarian who is advising you not to include it in some of your pieces of legislation. So again, that's just a little reminder in terms of the political situation on the federal minimum wage. But how could they actually remedy this with Democrats set to get absolutely obliterated in 2022 in the midterms and 2024 probably to Donald Trump? Well, what could they actually do? Well, they could look at the political reality of what the American people want in terms of material economic relief. And we got this lesson back in November 2020 when it was Joe Biden versus Donald Trump in Florida in a matchup. And we saw that the $15 minimum wage vote got more votes and a larger percentage than either of them in the state of Florida. So here from Vox, the lesson Democrats Democrats should take from Florida's $15 minimum wage vote, Florida voted for Trump, but it also voted for a $15 minimum wage. So let's just get into a little bit of the data here to show you the wide discrepancy that existed between these types of votes. So Donald Trump, who won, okay, with only 51% of the vote in Florida, he got roughly 5.7 million votes in the state of Florida. And the $15 minimum wage in the state of Florida got 6.4 roughly percent, or 6.4 roughly million votes for that ballot initiative, and it got 61% of the vote. Okay, so Donald Trump won the state with 51%, and $15 minimum wage won the state also with 61%, nearly a 10 percentage margin for the $15 minimum wage over the winner of the 2020 election in Florida. And you see here also the pure numbers gap, okay? This vote got nearly 700,000 more votes than Donald Trump. So what does that tell you about the fact that $15 minimum wage, obviously economic populism, right, succeeds even in a conservative state like Florida, and yet Joe Biden gets absolutely clobbered? Well, it tells you there is clearly a difference between what Joe Biden is advertising and what he is actually fighting for and getting passed versus what voters want, okay? So Joe Biden seems to think that the trend the Democrats should be going with, and basically the entire Democratic establishment seems to think this, that the trend that they need to be going in to win in 2022 and 2024 is that they need to move further to the right, that there's this like broad consensus within the Democratic establishment that they have somehow moved too far to the left, that they are, listening to the radical lefties like AOC and Bernie Sanders within their party. No, the fuck you aren't, okay? The lesson, if anything, from 2020 or from the current political situation that we have right now is that Joe Biden is not moving to the left enough. Okay, and people see that. All right, I don't need to remind you guys this, but I've said this so many times on this channel. If you go and look at the data, okay, of when Joe Biden's approval rating was at its maximum point, it was like weeks, literally a couple weeks after he sent out the $1,400 checks. Now, imagine if those checks had been $2,000 as previously promised. Imagine if those checks had been monthly checks, okay? I don't think we would have seen the same decline rapidly in Joe Biden's approval rating as we have seen, okay? The fact of the matter is, when you help people economically, when you improve their material conditions, they will support you, okay? It's really not that complicated. And when you go months or nearly a year without actually substantively delivering on any of the economic material relief that you promise people, then you're going to start losing support from them, okay? Again, it's really not that complicated. So I'll leave it off with here because I think the reality of all of this, the minimum wage discourse, can be summed up in a great quote from FDR from the Depression era. So in a speech on Depression recovery measures, FDR stated bluntly, quote, "It seems to me to be equally plain that no business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. And by living wages, I mean more than a bare subsistence level. I mean wages of a decent living." So listen, you can have critiques of FDR, say he didn't go far enough. I certainly would agree with many of those critiques, but the fact of the matter is he's 100% right. Under our current capitalist mode of production, a living wage has to be the bare fucking minimum. Otherwise, what are we really talking about here? We're just talking about labor exploitation at a mass level being baked into our economy. The fact of the matter is exactly what he just said there, okay? If a business cannot afford to pay its workers a living wage, and I don't mean, a purely $15 minimum wage, because as we've seen, there are many counties around the United States where $15 is not even enough. So what he's saying there is absolutely correct. If a business cannot afford to pay its workers an actual living wage that is a comfortable wage, not a bare subsistence wage, if you can't afford to do that, you are an entirely illegitimate business, okay? And you don't deserve to exist, all right? Because your business model relies entirely on mass labor exploitation. So that's the fundamental reality of this. It's somewhat good news, and I hope that, one of you guys or anybody in the audience does get a raise increase, because something is better than nothing. But at the end of the day, we are talking about crumbs here, okay? We are talking about barely taking a couple steps on the field when we have an entire, 100-yard sprint to go. So, it's not enough, but it's somewhat of a movement in the right direction. And hopefully some of these ballot initiatives can be a wake-up call to Democrats to actually realize that delivering on material relief to people is a good election strategy.